Video covers the origins of life, which I will also ask the question, where did we come from? As I said in class, I think the two most important things that humans can actually ask is, where did we come from, and are we alone? This is a long list of events, but I think they are important. Now, to remember, science works on evidence that's gathered from observations. There are many different explanations for how the world came into being, but the scientific explanation is the one that we see here. This is based on evidence we've collected from a variety of sources, including fossils, including observations of deep space, including the decay of radioactive isotopes like uranium or carbon-14. That's the story that's developed through science. Now, as evidence comes in and new evidence comes in, that story may change slightly, but the best explanation we have so far is what we see here. We have a universe that's about 13.77 billion years old. It started in something which is usually referred to as the Big Bang. That was the event where all of the matter in the universe and all of the energy in the universe got its start, as well as space in the universe. This space has continually been expanding ever since. You notice that this is a very confusing time. We have a general idea of what may have happened in the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang, or the first 5,000 years. Our observations come from about 300, 400,000 years ago, and we have microwave background radiation, which was actually initially discovered in New Jersey. That's kind of the basis for our understanding. The stuff that we see behind this observation is the theory to explain how our universe developed over the first few 100,000 years of time. But that, in comparison to a 13.77 billion year universe, is a very short time period. And our Milky Way galaxy really got started around near the time when matter started clumping together in the universe. Stars started forming. Our Milky Way is a fairly old galaxy. And nearly 10 million years went past before our sun developed. As I said in class, our sun is a third-generation star, which meant 2 generations of stars needed to build up hydrogen and helium, change more hydrogen into helium, and over time, as they heated up, they changed helium into carbon, into oxygen, into sulfur, into iron. When finally these very large stars exploded, ejected the remaining contents of their internal parts, so all of this iron and everything else, in these enormous explosions called supernova. These supernova then went on to develop new dust clouds and new planets and new stars from the leftover hydrogen that was able to shine again. Our sun is a third generation, which means it has a lot of heavy elements in it. It has a lot of iron in it. It has a lot of gold in it. It has a lot of mercury in it, compared to much older stars, which are mostly hydrogen and helium. Just to be aware of that. All of the ingredients to make us, and to make our sun, and to make our earth, all came from stars that lived and died before the sun formed. The earth formed shortly after the sun started shining. It formed out of the disk of gas, leftover material, gas and dust, leftover material from when the sun formed. That's when all of the planets formed, leftover hydrogen, leftover helium, leftover silicon, leftover iron, all came to become the planets as we know them. There were actually more planets in the early solar system. I have a little show that on the next slide that kind of indicates that. Our Earth cooled about 4 billion years ago. Now Mars at this time had liquid water. Mars was a much more pleasant place to live in the early days of the solar system. There is some question of whether Earth life may have started on Mars instead of Earth, and then was transported through an asteroid or meteorite impact on Mars, blasting some rocks with life on them to Earth. That's a possibility. We also know that there's a lot of organic compounds, as I'll say a little bit later on. Lots of organic molecules, lots of amino acids, RNA, things like that lots of nucleic acids are on comets. So life may have not have necessarily begun on Earth. It may have begun somewhere else and then was carried to Earth. The interesting thing we see is that the first life appears on Earth very shortly after the Earth cools down, which either means it's fairly easy for life to develop, or life came from somewhere else and started growing on this Earth. We see very good fossils, definite evidence of bacteria by 3.5 billion years ago. We know that life had to have started from something else at least 3.7 billion years ago. We see some evidence. Some people claim to see evidence even closer to 4 billion years ago of the earliest life on Earth. Eukaryotes, we'll discuss. Eukaryotes have a nucleus in their cells. Their DNA is arranged on chromosomes with a linear portion of DNA, not a circular DNA. We'll talk about that as we go forward. But the first eukaryotes, and animals, plants, fungi are eukaryotes. They appear about 2.7 billion years ago. A little bit of a controversy on when exactly that happened, but that's what the evidence seems to indicate. Then we reach the Great Oxygen Catastrophe. A certain group of bacteria called cyanobacteria started dumping their waste product, which was oxygen, into the atmosphere. Oxygen turned out to be very harmful to a lot of living organisms, which at that time were primarily bacteria, eukaryotes, and this other group of organisms called archaea. Oxygen was dangerous at that time. Some organisms learned to adapt and found ways of using oxygen. Now, we, as multicellular organisms, can't live without it. Prior to that time, all life was single-celled. Multicellular life appears after the Great Oxygen Catastrophe, because once certain bacteria learned how to use oxygen, multicellular organisms were able to process energy more efficiently and grow larger. That happened about 1.2 billion years ago. Those were primarily evidence of multicellular plants. Animals don't come onto the scene as multicellular until about 600 billion years ago, where we see evidence of things like jellyfish for the first time. Fish came in a little bit later. Fish started climbing on land about 0.375 billion years ago. When we get more into evolution, we'll talk about the actual fish that did this, but we do have fossil evidence of fish that could walk on land and breathe air. We also have evidence of fish even today that are walking on land and breathing air. So it's pretty well supported by the evidence that we and all land-living backboned animals originally evolved from fish. Just to give a little perspective, the first dinosaurs appeared about 250 million years ago, which seems like a long time, but we're talking about 13 billion years to 1/4 billion years. This is actually a fairly recent event. First humans were about 1 million years ago, which is 0.001 billion years ago. Those are the first upright walking apes that were making tools, which are what we would recognize probably as a human today. But those humans still went through a long evolutionary process to get a larger brain, better tools. We didn't start agriculture until about 0.00001 billion years ago, which compared to 13 billion, this is a tiny number. And all of our written history and all of our traditions came after this time. So all of the religious traditions came after this time of agriculture. Now the video, I'll post a separate link to this video. It's about a 10-minute video if you feel like sitting through the whole thing. It is a cool video, but I'm not going to show it as part of this particular presentation. This is what I was referencing earlier. These are the conditions that we think life needed in order to exist, or life needed in order to develop. We have a Goldilocks zone around our sun that's not too hot, not too cold. However, Venus, which is a little bit closer to the sun, has a very, very thick atmosphere. It also doesn't have a lot of iron in its core. Mars has a very, very thin atmosphere. Earth is about the same size as Venus. Earth should have an extremely thick atmosphere like Venus does. But what we know is that something must have pushed off a lot of Earth's atmosphere, so it's not so thick and heat trapping. At the same time, Earth has a lot of iron in its core. Earth is a magnetic substance. An iron core of our planet gives us a magnetic field. So the strongest hypothesis that we have is that this other planet called Theia was very close to our orbit, possibly even in the same orbital range as we were, that planet, which had its own iron, crashed into our Earth, super enriched our Earth with iron, blew off a lot of our atmosphere, and then a lot of this material you see that was cast up from the collision and the explosion, the entire surface of the Earth melted. The extra material that was kicked off of that explosion ended up coming together through gravity to form our moon. And a moon is important because it stabilizes the orbit and the seasons of our planet. Very crucial to have a moon, we think, in order to see life develop. Many people argue we also need a Jupiter, a very large planet. Jupiter is much larger than all of the other planets put together. It has a lot of gravity. It helps to actually keep asteroids and comets and other large objects from crashing into the Earth regularly. If we had a lot of asteroids and comets crashing into the Earth, life would not be able to exist, because we had one asteroid that crashed into our planet about 65 million years ago that wiped out a lot of life on planet Earth, including all of the non-avian or non-bird dinosaurs that lived during that time. So asteroid collisions are very bad for a planet that has life on it, and we have Jupiter to thank for not getting hit a lot more often with asteroids and comets and other debris. This is a time lapse. It should have been a time lapse of the Shoemaker-Levy comet crashing into Jupiter. It happened in my lifetime, but I don't exactly remember the year. We did do a video. I did post a video about the Miller-Urey experiments, where they showed that with elements that are very abundant in our solar system, many planets have water, many planets have hydrogen, many planets have ammonia, many planets have methane, and these are hypothesized to be the same conditions as early Earth. When we put these ingredients together, which may have been the gases in Earth's early atmosphere, notice there is no oxygen, we expose them to an electric spark, we're making amino acids, we're making the building blocks of life. Ethanoic acid is acetic acid, that's vinegar. Lactic acid, that's something that our muscles produce. Urea, that's in urine. We're seeing a lot of molecules that actually exist in biology from these very simple ingredients in this experiment. We've also included CO2, carbon dioxide, in these things, as well as some phosphorus, and we were able to produce nucleotides. The building blocks of DNA, RNA also are able to be produced from these very simple sorts of setups. We've also don't necessarily had to have gotten our amino acids and nucleic acids, nucleotides, from material that existed on the Earth, although that is entirely possible. We do find RNA, we do find amino acids, we see them in comets, we see them, this is Enceladus, one of Saturn's moons, we see them in asteroids. Nebula are also known, these are exploded stars. This is one of those supernova. This will eventually form new planets and new suns out of these clouds of gas. But we do see complex molecules, or definitely organic molecules, such as ethanol, in these sorts of locations. The ingredients for life might be very common throughout the universe. The question is, how did those ingredients come together to form actual life? One thing that needed to happen was we needed to go from something that is a monomer, and these easily appear in simple experiments. We easily make amino acids, we easily make nucleotides. They had to become polymers. So we took these monomers, we had some sort of dehydration synthesis to make the polymers. When amino acids get heated, or when they're dried, they can oftentimes form polymers. Condensation reactions are the dehydration synthesis, that's what we've discussed before. Those are forming those peptide bonds between amino acids. The phosphodiester bond, which is the one that holds nucleic acids together, both of these things happen under certain conditions without needing a living thing, a living organism. They can happen chemically. And they were necessary for life to get started. We also see phospholipids, so lipids with a phosphate group on them. When we put them in water, they form these vesicles in micelles, which are basically the same structure we'd see in a cell membrane, which is another structure we'll talk about as we go on. So a lot of these ingredients for life can come together without there needing to be a living thing. And the possible way that life got started was these molecules started getting together in the right places where something could actually start making copies of itself and become the first living organism. Clay is an excellent surface for different particles to come together and get concentrated, because clay is very good at grabbing some of these molecules, and they're able to bring molecules close enough that they may actually become the macromolecules that we need. We do see these things called coacervates, which are groupings of these polymers, so proteins, nucleic acids, lipids, that actually do grow and divide. This is very close to what we would see in a living organism. Before there was life on this planet, we may have had these clusters of molecules that were able to start growing and multiplying. And then eventually they got so good at it, they became the first life forms. One of the strongest cases for life getting started is what is called the RNA world hypothesis. RNA is able to pass information from one generation to another. It does that by maybe these molecules came together on a clay particle or something. They polymerized. They went from a monomer to a polymer through dehydration synthesis. They were able to make copies of themselves into these strands. These strands of RNA is known to interact with amino acids and would start making proteins. RNA does a lot of things that enzymes also do. And RNA is good at moving other molecules around or changing other molecules. This is what proteins are also very good at. So the first step towards life would possibly be, in the RNA world hypothesis, is that RNA, which is fairly easily formed through natural conditions and fairly easy to polymerize, was able to start making copies of itself. Once it could make copies of itself, it would start interacting with amino acids, which we also know are very easy to find in early Earth conditions. And it started polymerizing them. It started taking proteins and making long chains called polypeptides. Those proteins could then do some other additional functions. And once those were enclosed within a cell membrane, we were able to get the process started where RNA was able to act first something like an enzyme, like a protein, but then it was also able to make proteins that were able to take over a lot of the jobs in the cell. And RNA was eventually able to find a way of making DNA, which is a much more stable sort of genetic code for life, much more stable in a DNA molecule. And that was eventually what happened. The first living things are not like bacteria today. The first living things are not like anything we could really imagine on Earth today. Bacteria, archaea, which we'll see, all of them are actually very, very advanced compared to what the first molecules or the first organisms were like. And while RNA is still used in many processes in the cell, RNA oftentimes works as a coding sort of a molecule, which is used to build proteins. It can also do its own work, and then it's also used as a DNA template so that DNA can make copies of itself. RNA is very important for many of these different functions, which is why we think RNA may have been the first molecule to get the whole process started. As I said, polypeptides, proteins, are good at making three-dimensional structures that do very complex processes. Now, RNA can do it somewhat. Proteins do it better. What happened over time is that these RNA polynucleotides started putting together protein polypeptides. And they still do that today. When we start learning about transcription and translation, we'll see how RNA directs the formation of proteins, proteins which do very good jobs within the cell. This was a partnership that was very important at the very beginning of life. And even today, we see a lot of information, DNA coding goes to RNA coding, which goes to forming polypeptides, which become proteins. This is the whole process. What we know about life is called the central dogma of biology. This is what we'll start focusing on. Here we have a nucleus. We'll talk about that in my next video, what that means. But DNA is the code nowadays. DNA is transcribed into RNA. RNA then leaves the nucleus, and RNA is the code in order to make proteins. What we think originally was RNA may have been the original code. Eventually it was taken over by DNA, which is a much more stable molecule, and RNA also directs the formation of proteins, which is essential for many functions within the cell today. As I said, DNA is more stable than RNA. Just by virtue of it being a better molecule, more stable molecule, it would eventually take over as the coding information. The very earliest life forms that had DNA had a better chance of passing on their code than those that only use RNA. We do see evidence, even today, of RNA passing information to DNA with an enzyme, one of these special proteins that do a special job. Reverse transcriptase can take the code from RNA and turn it into DNA. So we know it's definitely possible, if RNA was the original genetic information, it's very possible for RNA to be translated or transcribed back to DNA. We see a protein, an enzyme today called reverse transcriptase that makes this possible. So maybe the original RNA made this protein called reverse transcriptase, which did a good job of turning RNA to DNA. Once DNA was the genetic information, it was more stable, and those organisms would have an advantage in passing on their code, whereas the other ones with RNA weren't as good at passing on their code, so the DNA ones ended up surviving. And as we know today, all life, as we define it, has DNA as its code. When we had the nucleotides and the polynucleotides, the nucleic acids, and the polypeptides, the proteins together, they would originally would have been in open water, in a solution. If one RNA molecule made a really good protein in solution, any other RNA molecule could have stolen that protein. But we also had, especially around these things called white smokers, very hot volcanic features underwater, we have these lipids. And these lipids have a phosphate group on their head and a hydrophobic tail. They make these things called vesicles in water, where the hydrophilic parts are on the outside, the hydrophobic parts are on the inside, because these are long chains of carbons and hydrogens. They're non-polar, and this is the polar region. So all of these polar regions automatically make the structure where their hydrophilic portions are on the outside and on the inside, because they're liquid inside a cell. And then they have their hydrophobic portions, which make this layer that separates them. So big molecules like RNA and protein don't easily pass inside to outside the cell. Once one of these really good RNA molecules made a really good protein and would help it to keep making a protein that helps it survive and helps it make copies of itself, if this RNA molecule ends up with this really good protein inside a vesicle, now it has the advantage. No other RNA molecule can steal this particular cell's RNA molecule or the code to make the really good proteins. So now we have a cell that is enabling, that has an advantage, because now this cell has the advantage of keeping those really good proteins to itself. It improves its chances for survival, whereas the free-floating proteins in RNA don't have that advantage. So cell membranes may have been the first containing package for RNA and proteins to become a living organism, which could then evolve because it had an advantage, and any of these little vesicles that could reproduce better than other vesicles, this one would have a chance of surviving and out-competing other organisms. Now, the next thing we really need to understand is evolution. This is one of the definitions for life. When we look at science, the simplest explanation is usually how do I want to say this? Science is based on gathering evidence. All of the evidence that we can gather points to evolution as being the key to how life has progressed on this planet. And I'll talk more about this in class, but nothing in biology will make sense if we don't understand it through the light of evolution. And with that, I will conclude this video and upload it so that you can take notes on it. Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Eastburn.
Hello, Sam. I finished that video just in time.
What video were you watching?